our first guest, let's just bring him on and he can tell us what's going on. So please welcome Elliot Robinson. Elliot, come on in. Hello there, sir.
Hey, good evening. How are you?
All right. Okay. Now, I'm just an ignorant drag queen. Okay. So you've got a bunch of letters after your name, and you got a bunch of fancy diplomas behind you. What does that all mean?
Well, the JD just means that I'm a graduate of Howard Law School, and the MDiv, I got my Master of Divinity from Emory University.
All right, glad. So, a lawyer and a minister. Would you classify as a minister?
Yes, that's accurate. Yes.
Oh, very good. Very. See, I've got all my diplomas behind me too, so we're on the same playing field tonight.
That's right.
All right. So, as Russell mentioned, you are an expert, or you like to talk about the Jim Crow laws and their effect on our country and society today. All right. Please educate me. I've heard of Jim Crow laws all my life, but I have no idea who or what was Jim Crow. Where did that come from?
Well, it's I guess it's not funny, but the origin of the actual term Jim Crow comes from an era when blackface and minstrel shows were really popular in the United States in the 18 started by like around the 1820s. The father of Jim Crow as a what we would consider vaudeville, but at that time it was blackface or minstrel shows, was Thomas Dartmouth Rice, and the rumor or the legend has it basically he was a regular performer. Um, he saw two African American stable men outside of a performance hall in Louisville singing a song, and the song he ended up liking the song. He took the song and kind of tweaked it and turned it into a ditty, basically about this character Jim Crow. Well, what happened is he then took his show and then revolved it around really negative caricatures about the two men, but he would blacken his face and then do these what we would now consider minstrel shows or minstrel ditties or minstrel acts during his show, and it became incredibly popular. And so what happened is that this caricature became attached to what would become Jim Crow laws that occurred later. And so that was like the predecessor of the laws was this Jim Crow caricature, and literally they were everywhere. I mean, and the crazy part is they were more popular in the North than they were in the South. And so
Okay. So the negative. So what type of laws are we talking about?
And so the Jim Crow laws that were created, they came after the end of the Civil War. And so you had a variety of different types of laws. So you had the more formal laws that we think about, things like basically where you can, like no black person can cut the hair of a white person. Blacks and whites can't be buried in the same cemetery. Obviously, people cannot be married if they're of different races. Blacks and whites could not frequent the same parks. They couldn't frequent the same beaches. And in many instances, blacks were not even allowed on beaches. Some of the ones that were just even more insane, for example, you had a law in Louisiana where blacks and whites at the schools of the blind had to be separated by race, even though they couldn't even see one another. Yeah, I mean, exactly. It got to be that absurd. Blacks and whites couldn't play pool together because the idea was that you can't have any social interaction where you're being considered equal. But I think the thing that has carried over the most are the laws that had to do with what's called social etiquette. And so these are things that really take the strict, harsh laws, the hard line laws, and then turn them into human interaction. So, for example, a black person could never insinuate or assert that a white person was lying. You could never suggest that a white person is inferior in any way. You cannot claim or demonstrate having superior knowledge or intelligence. You couldn't curse at a white person. You could not laugh at a white person. You couldn't comment at the appearance of a white woman. And then also things like if a white person was approaching you on the street, you had to step off the curb. If you were already standing and someone was passing you, you had to hold your head down. If you were approaching someone and they were talking to you, you had to take your hat off and never look them in the eye. So these were all things that would assert further assert the idea that one was superior over the other. And so those are some of the vestiges that we deal with today. And so, yeah, so those are some of the vestiges. More the social etiquette is what has continued on today, as opposed to those hard and fast laws that we see.
All right. So I don't know how old you are, but where did you grow up?
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm
Okay.
51, so I'm proud of my age.
Are you
I
sure?
share
Go
it
ahead.
now. Yeah, once you get over 50, you don't care what anybody else thinks anymore. So yeah, I'm
No, no, no,
51.
no. So growing up, did you feel any of those pressures or?
Absolutely. In New York, it's funny. Well, not funny, haha, funny, but funny, irony, funny. When you think of New York, especially when I was the era I grew up in, they were still touting America as the great American melting pot. Like that was still a thing. We were proud of it as a country. You come over here, it's great, blah, blah, blah. But we also had sundown towns in New York City. And so for those who don't know, sundown towns are just that. By sundown, if you're black, you better not let the sun set and you are still in that town. And so, for example, we had areas like Bay Ridge, Bensonhurst, um, maybe Marine Park too. But if you were black, you knew pretty much you don't want to be in those areas after dark, because it's like, well, what are you doing here? We need to make sure you get out of here, and you understand that. Some of them you couldn't really go during the daytime either. And so, yes, you could definitely feel that. I went to Catholic school, and so elementary school, it wasn't bad. But when I went to high school, it was definitely there. This notion
And
that
you're
why are
talking
you?
the 1970s,
Mhm.
1980s?
Yeah, the 80s. Yeah, in the 80s. Yeah, I went to high school from 83 to 87. So yeah. So it was still very much, there's still this why are you here? You shouldn't be here, even though I'm just as smart or smarter than my classmates, but it's just like you shouldn't be here. So you still have that superiority, inferiority aspect that you still have to deal with.
So what is your mission now? What are you doing with this knowledge and
Well,
experience?
I started a nonprofit called Creative Tension. And the purpose of Creative Tension is really to be able to share with individuals the history and the legacy of Jim Crow segregation. And one of the ways that we do that is through our podcast. And so we've done 2 seasons of the podcast where we look at different caricatures, we look at different times in history, in order to be able to to create a bridge to show people, yes, this is what happened then, but then this is what we see now that helps us to understand better what happened then. The reason why I started doing the podcast, my uncle, who has since passed, we would ride from DC to New York together. And during that time, he would share stories. He was the funniest person around. And so he would share stories of growing up in Sumter, South Carolina, which is where my dad is from. And he would share these stories that my dad never shared. And so we're riding and he's telling me stories about, I mean, some of them are just like, this just cannot be true, because at the time I had never heard of them. And at this point, I graduated college. I was in law school. So I was 22, 23, 24 years old. He's telling me stories of people who were caught dating. So a black kid would be caught dating a white girl. And this one in particular was a friend of his. And by the time the kid got home, um, a friend of the family said, your son has been caught with this dating this white girl. He needs to get out of town before sunset, because if he doesn't, they're going to get him. And so an instance where that happened, where they had to get him out of town. My uncle knew another instance where a guy got into a fight. Teenagers, they get into a fight, a scuffle. The black kid won the fight. Unfortunately, it ended up being the police came to the mom's house and said, well, look, we know your son got into a fight with so-and-so. Don't worry. We're just going to make sure he gets on the bus. We don't want any problems going on. And she literally never heard from her son again. And so there are instances like that happened. My dad had another instance where that happened as well. A friend of his, again, dating a girl, white girl, got caught. They were able to get him out of town, but he could never return back to Sumter. So whenever he had a death in the family, whenever he had a wedding, the family of the girl would be sitting outside the church at every funeral. And so my dad said he thinks he never really returned to Sumter until he died, and they buried him back at Sumter. And so
Wow.
this was like 50 years went by from the time that this happened. And they would just be there. If someone in his family died, they'd be at the funeral, sitting outside the church, waiting to see if he came back. So stories like that really sparked my interest, because I'm saying, well, why would you never tell me these stories? Like, this is, and as I began to study and research, I realized that it's really a form of PTSD. And my parents' generation would pretty much say, we're just going to go forward. That's behind us. We're just going to go forward. We're just going to go forward. We're going to make the best with where things are going, and never talk about it and share with my generation, the Gen Xers. So the Gen Xers, a lot of us never knew what our parents really went through growing up during the Jim Crow era. And so it wasn't until I began to research it and to understand, like, wow, this is insane. One, but two, not sharing it, you're carrying this trauma. And so the fear of what they had seen and experienced, they would share with us in a different way, by warnings, by things telling us not to do, by, people say, oh, Black people don't do the talk. Yes, we do. Our parents share with us all these lists of rules and social etiquettes that they think will help us be safe. They never tell us why they were sharing it, or what they learned growing up that made them feel the need to have to share it as harshly as they would share it with us, but they wouldn't give us the backstory. So we had no way to connect it to what their life was like. We only had the rule. My mother would say, now don't you be bringing no white girls home now. Don't you be dating no white girls, don't you do it. No, sir. And I would say, well,
Wow.
Ma, this is, but they had seen, and they knew what could happen. And my mother would always just say, you just have to, I know people are changed, but it was very hard for her, given what she had seen for the most formative years of her life, to believe that people could really change that much, that fully, that I would be safe. And I think the saddest thing is, now they live in a world where it has come back. That mentality has become mainstream again.
Okay, I was going to ask, where are we? Have we progressed from that, or do you see a reversal?
I think it's a reckoning. And so I wouldn't say that it's a reversal. I think that it has mainstreamed that mentality. And I think people are being desensitized to their own humanity. And so, for example, whenever something bad happens, like we'll just use the instance where there is a police killing and it's videotaped. There's a concerted effort to desensitize people's empathy towards another person, by saying, well, what did that person do? Well, what could have happened? Because the idea is, then they must have deserved it, as opposed to, this is a person, another human being. At least be allowed to feel empathy for that person, but there is a concerted effort to not allow others to feel that empathy. And I think that along with all the other things that are happening, yes, there is definitely a resurgence. There's a resurgence of dividing people. There's a resurgence of trying to keep that feeling of, well, we're better than they are, especially when you're talking about anti-immigrant language, even though most of the people who are pushing it are the children of immigrants or the grandchildren of immigrants, and so that's the part, I think, that is very disconcerting, because we are in some ways going back there. I think the other side is, because we have more knowledge now, people have more awareness, a lot more people are wanting to understand, well, why do I have a bias? Okay, well, what is it that I don't know that I thought I knew about this country? Because the era, we learn about the time period, but we don't learn about the era of Jim Crow. So we learn about the US history, that doesn't stop. When you're in school, you get it all. And then you go for African Americans' perspective, you go from slavery, and then you go to civil rights, but you skip Jim Crow, and you skip how, and as you're learning from things from about 1876 to 1995, there is a system in place that tells Blacks separate but equal. But we know it was not separate. It was separate, but it was not equal. But it was a systematic suppression and oppression of Blacks and Browns, and immigrant groups, which people don't realize that as well. Italians were persecuted as well through Jim Crow. Initially, so were those who were Irish. They weren't through Jim Crow, but they were also oppressed. And so anyone who came in, obviously people who were from Asia, because you had different acts, specific acts, like limiting the number of people from different countries, like China and India, and then they were expelled. And that's why that's why the numbers are not as large as they should be, given how early they were immigrating into the United States, because at one point they were expelled from the United States. And then we know what happened with World War II. So we have these periods, but we don't weave it together. We kind of talk broadly America, but we don't want to look bad. But it happened. Right. So you have to talk about it, because if you don't talk about it, you end up with the forces that we have now that want to tell you, well, slavery really wasn't that bad. And well, black people they've been free from slavery, since 1867, 65, no, 1865 and the Civil War. But you're skipping 100 years where black folks couldn't do anything. They couldn't own much. And whatever they owned, you had the right to take at will. The level of violence was just legendary, and the level of random violence. I suggest to people, if you want to go to Duke University's website, they have a project called Behind the Veil, and Behind the Veil is an oral history project where they actually interviewed Jim Crow survivors, and it's sometimes it's a little hard to listen to. Some of them are great to listen to, but these are individuals who were interviewed about their experience during the Jim Crow era. And that's
so Elliot, you covered these stories in your podcast?
Yes, I have. And some of them I actually have live. I have the audio archives that I weave into some of the episodes. So I absolutely do. Yes, I do have those in there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Elliot. You've told me a lot, and I have to think about a lot of things. So thank you so much. We'll bring you back later on in the show. So hang on there, Elliot. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you. Oh my. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Elliot, for sharing with us.